Trump admitted something at a funeral that no speechwriter would have put in his remarks, and once he said it, there was no taking it back. That is the moment worth sitting with. Not the tears, not the flags, not the motorcade rolling through the streets of Washington. The moment that actually matters here is a single unscripted sentence, delivered in front of a cathedral full of senators, cabinet secretaries, and two sitting heads of state, in which the President of the United States said out loud what political observers had whispered about Lindsey Graham for the better part of 3 decades. Graham died suddenly on July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, after suffering an aortic dissection tied to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. He had just returned from a trip to Kiev, and Trump later said he had spoken with a senator that Saturday evening, calling it possibly their last conversation. His office initially described the death only as a brief and sudden illness, before the D.C. medical examiner's preliminary findings clarified the cause. Within days, the tribute started pouring in from both sides of the aisle, the kind of bipartisan grief that only shows up when someone has spent enough years in Washington to make enemies and friends in equal measure. But it was the funeral itself, held at the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, that turned into the real story. Because Trump, standing at the podium to deliver a eulogy for a man he called one of his closest allies, did not simply read from prepared remarks. He drifted from them. And in drifting, he confirmed something that followed Graham through his entire Senate career. Let's start with a line everyone is still talking about. Trump told the mourners that Graham was extremely hawkish, that he never saw a war he didn't like. He added that only Graham's true friends would understand what that meant, framing it as devotion rather than bloodlust, insisting Graham believed it was for the good of the country. Trump went further, saying Graham felt in his bones that America's destiny was to win, and that his job was to make sure the country's enemies lost. He tied that conviction directly to Graham's decades in uniform, noting it was the same drive that kept him serving in the Air Force Reserves and Air National Guard, even while sitting in the Senate, and the same drive that sent him as a lawmaker to nearly every corner of the globe to confront adversaries and stand beside allies. Now, on the surface, that might read like a fairly standard eulogy line. Politicians get memorialized for their convictions all the time, but context is everything here, and the context is this. For years, critics on the left and even some voices on the right had accused Graham of exactly that reputation, a senator who reflexively backed military intervention, who rarely met a conflict he didn't want America involved in. That label followed him from the Iraq War all the way through his advocacy on Ukraine, and Graham's own team spent years pushing back on it, insisting his hawkishness was really about deterrence and alliance building rather than appetite for war. Hearing Trump stand at his funeral and essentially say, yes, that reputation was accurate, was a genuinely startling moment. Not because it was cruel. Trump clearly meant it as praise, as a tribute to a man he respected. But it landed as confirmation, delivered by the one person whose word on this carried the most weight, in the room where the fewest people expected him to say it. And the reaction inside that cathedral was not universal. Fox News host Sean Hannity, one of Graham's closest friends in conservative media, gave his own eulogy that same day and pushed back almost directly against the framing Trump had just offered. Hannity argued that Graham had been unfairly saddled with the warmonger label for years, and that what Graham actually wanted, more than anything, was a lasting peace across the Middle East and beyond. He pointed to Graham's personal relationships with leaders like Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, both of whom were seated in the cathedral that day, as proof that Graham's foreign policy instincts were about building stability, not chasing conflict for its own sake. It was a striking thing to watch play out live. One of Graham's oldest friends essentially used his own turn to the podium to gently correct the President of the United States, in front of the very family the eulogies were meant to comfort. So you had this striking split happening in real time, in the same service, within the same hour. Trump essentially admitting, almost proudly, that Graham loved to fight. And Hannity, standing at the same podium not long after, trying to walk that framing back in front of the same audience. Two men who both considered themselves close to Graham, offering the public two very different versions of who he really was. Reports afterward noted that Graham's own sister had made similar remarks in a separate conversation with Fox News, insisting her brother did not love war itself, but rather loved the idea of ending it, even if he believed at times that war was the only path to get there. It's worth pausing on why this matters beyond a single awkward funeral moment. Graham spent 23 years in the Senate representing South Carolina, following a career that included 6 years of active duty as an Air Force lawyer and decades more in the Air Force Reserves and Air National Guard, eventually retiring as a colonel. Foreign policy wasn't a hobby for him. It was the center of his political identity. He was a driving force behind hawkish positions on Iraq, on Syria, on Ukraine, a senator who traveled to conflict zones more often than almost anyone else on Capitol Hill, including a trip to Kiev just before his death, his 10th wartime visit to the country. When Trump says in a eulogy that this man never saw a war he didn't like, he is not inventing a caricature out of nowhere. He is naming a pattern that biographers and political reporters had documented for years, one that Graham himself never fully denied, even as his sister and allies insisted the label oversimplified him. There's a second thread running through that same eulogy that deserves attention, too, because it shows how personal history and political theater collided in front of the entire world. Trump used part of his remarks to revisit the infamous 2016 incident when, during the bitter Republican primary, he read Graham's personal cell phone number aloud to a live crowd after Graham had called him a name on television. Trump openly acknowledged it was something he shouldn't have done. Then he turned into a punchline, joking that Graham got the last laugh. Because while Trump's stunt blew up Graham's phone for a single day, Graham turned around and called him constantly for the next decade, cementing what became one of the more unlikely friendships in modern American politics. Trump added, almost as an aside, that he had no idea what became of that old phone, joking that it simply exploded under the weight of the calls that followed. It is a strange thing to admit at a funeral. Trump effectively conceded, in front of Graham's family, in front of dignitaries flown in from active conflict zones, that he had crossed a line with an old rival turned friend. And yet he used that admission as comic relief, pivoting straight into a joke about how the relationship recovered anyway. Reporters covering the service noted that Trump veered from his prepared remarks more than once that day, at one point taking issue with a line about Graham's popularity and adding, half-jokingly, that not everybody actually liked him, before calling him a tough cookie and moving on. Observers in the room described moments of genuine laughter breaking out among the mourners, an unusual sound for a funeral of this scale, but one that seemed to fit a man who had spent his career mixing sharp political combat with an easy, personable charm. None of this happened in a vacuum, either. Around the same time as the funeral, Trump gave an interview to NBC's Kristen Welker on Meet the Press, where he discussed a phone call he'd had with Graham the evening before his death, describing Graham as exhausted from the flight back from Ukraine, but still pushing him on a piece of stalled elections legislation. In that same interview, Trump was asked who might replace Graham in the Senate, and he said he already had someone in mind, though he declined to name them, saying it was too soon. That comment raised eyebrows fast, because under South Carolina law, the authority to appoint a replacement senator belongs solely to Governor Henry McMaster, not to the White House. Even as Trump praised McMaster's judgment and said he trusted him to do the right thing, the fact that Trump was already signaling a preference before Graham's family had even completed the funeral proceedings told its own story about how quickly Washington moves from mourning to maneuvering. In the days that followed, McMaster moved forward with the process of naming a temporary successor, ultimately turning to Graham's own sister, Darlene Graham Nordun, to serve out the remainder of his term, while a broader field of candidates, including a former governor and sitting members of Congress, began lining up for the special primary election to come. What makes all of this worth examining isn't scandal for scandal's sake. It's the layered picture it paints of a genuinely complicated public figure. Graham was a man capable of building deep, lasting friendships with people who had publicly humiliated him, a man who forged personal bonds with heads of state across ideological lines, evidenced by the fact that both Netanyahu and Zelensky made the trip to Washington to sit in that cathedral. He was also, by his own president's telling, a man who genuinely relished the fight, who believed in American military dominance as a moral good rather than a necessary evil. Those two things aren't necessarily in conflict. A person can build warmth and loyalty in private relationships while holding hardline convictions in public policy. But it's rare to hear a sitting president say the quiet part out loud, at a funeral no less, in front of the very people who spent years trying to reshape that narrative. Journalists and biographers who have tracked Graham's career for decades, from his early years in the House to his rise as one of the Senate's most recognizable foreign policy voices, have long described him as a study in contradictions, a workhorse legislator who could be simultaneously a fierce partisan combatant and a genuine deal-maker across the aisle. That duality showed up again in how his colleagues chose to remember him. Some praise his role in confirming Justice Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, a moment Trump himself called maybe Graham's finest hour in the Senate. Others focus on his military record, his decades of service that ran parallel to his political career, and others, like Hannity, focus on trying to correct what they saw as an unfair reputation before to calcify into his final legacy. Even Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who had served alongside Graham in the Senate for years, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were present that day, a reminder just how deeply Graham's influence had reached across the current administration, regardless of how bruising his path to that closeness with Trump had once been. There is also something worth noting about the sheer scale of that funeral, beyond who spoke and what was said. A funeral for a sitting United States senator does not typically pull sitting heads of state from two countries currently engaged in active conflict. Yet Graham's did. That alone speaks to relationships built over years of personal visits, direct phone calls, and a level of trust that most lawmakers never manage to cultivate with foreign leaders. It is easy to focus purely on the eulogy's more headline-grabbing lines, the joke about the phone number, the blunt admission about war. But the presence of Netanyahu and Zelensky in that room was its own quiet statement about the kind of political weight Graham carried behind the scenes, far from the cameras that usually captured him. In the end, what happened at that funeral wasn't really about a scandal or a gaffe. It was about the strange, unfiltered honesty that sometimes slips out when a person who is used to controlling every headline finds himself genuinely grieving. Trump didn't read a polished, focus group tribute. He told stories the way he actually remembered them, phone number stunt included, hawkish reputation included. And in doing so, he gave the country something rarer than a perfect eulogy. He gave an honest one, messy edges and all, the kind that reveals as much about the person delivering it as the person being remembered. Lindsey Graham spent his career being difficult to categorize, a senator who could infuriate his own party one week and rally around a Democratic president's Supreme Court nominee the next, a war hawk who somehow built friendships across some of the most divided lines in modern politics. Maybe that's exactly why his funeral ended up as complicated as it did. No single eulogy was ever going to capture a man who spent 3 decades being impossible to sum up in one sentence. Trump tried anyway, admitted more than he probably meant to, and in doing so, left the country with a portrait of Graham that was less a tidy tribute and more a genuine, unresolved reflection of who he really was. Whether that admission changes how history remembers him or simply confirms what people already believed, is something only time, and the historians who follow this story long after the cameras leave, will be able to answer.